Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The second chime at 9:15, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome, dear listeners, to another tale from the archives of Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and tonight I bring you a story that unfolds in the drawing rooms and shadowed corridors of English society, where time itself becomes both witness and accomplice to murder. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Shadows. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by a uniformed messenger to the modest flat shared by the renowned Belgian detective and his loyal companion. The envelope bore the Ashworth family crest, a griffin clutching a rose, and the heavy cream paper spoke of old money and older traditions. "Hastings, mon ami, we are summoned to dine with the aristocracy," the little detective announced, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. His egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he examined the elegant script. "Sir Reginald Ashworth requests the pleasure of our company this Saturday evening at Thornfield Manor." How curious that he should invite a humble detective to join his intimate gathering. Captain Hastings looked up from his morning paper, eyebrows raised. "Ashworth, the same fellow who made his fortune in shipping during the war. I read somewhere that he was knighted for his services to the Admiralty, précisément, and now it seems he wishes to entertain. But one wonders, Hastings, why a man of such standing should desire the presence of Hercule Poirot at his table. In my experience, such invitations are rarely extended for the pleasure of my conversation alone." The detective's green eyes held that familiar gleam of curiosity that Hastings had learned to recognize. It was the look of a man who sensed mystery in the air, like a hound catching the scent of a fox. As Saturday evening approached, the two companions found themselves in a hired motor car, winding through the Hampshire countryside toward Thornfield Manor. The October mist clung to the bare branches of ancient oaks, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds that surrounded their destination. Thornfield Manor rose before them like something from a Gothic romance, all towers and gables with ivy climbing its weathered stone walls. Light spilled from the tall windows, promising warmth and civilization within, yet there was something about the building that made Hastings suppress a shiver. "Rather a gloomy pile, isn't it?" he murmured as their car crunched up the gravel drive. "Ah, but observe, mon ami, how the architect has positioned those windows. Each room commands a view of the grounds, and from the towers one could see for miles across the countryside. This is not merely a home, it is a fortress designed by someone who valued both elegance and security." A butler of impressive bearing greeted them at the massive oak doors. His face was carved from the same stern material as the manor itself, and his movements possessed the fluid efficiency of a man who had spent decades in service to the quality. "Good evening, gentlemen. Sir Reginald awaits you in the drawing-room with the other guests. If you would be so kind as to follow me." They passed through a grand entrance hall dominated by an enormous grandfather clock, its brass pendulum catching the light as it swung with metronomic precision. The clock's face showed the time as 7:15, and its chimes seemed to resonate through the very bones of the building. "A magnificent timepiece," the detective observed, pausing to admire the intricate woodwork and brass fittings. "German manufacture, I believe, though the case appears to be English craftsmanship. Such clocks are renowned for their accuracy. One might set one's watch by their chimes." The drawing-room buzzed with the genteel conversation of 5 other guests, all of whom turned as the butler announced their arrival. Sir Reginald Ashworth proved to be a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and distinguished with the bearing of one accustomed to command. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, yet something in his eyes suggested a man wrestling with weighty concerns. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, welcome to Thornfield. I trust your journey was pleasant. Please, allow me to introduce you to my other guests." The introductions followed with the ritual precision of English society. There was Lady Margaret Worthington, a woman of perhaps 50 with steel-grey hair and the sharp eyes of one who missed nothing. Her nephew James Worthington stood beside her, a young man of 28 with the restless energy of the post-war generation. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the family physician, completed the medical trio with his wife, Mrs. Sarah Hartwell. The doctor appeared to be a man of science and discretion, while his wife possessed that particular English prettiness that ages gracefully into respectability. The final guest was perhaps the most intriguing, Colonel Anthony Mercer, a man whose bearing immediately marked him as military, though his left hand showed the stiffness of old wounds, and his eyes held the distant look of one who had seen too much of war's realities. As sherry was served and pleasantries exchanged, the detective's observant gaze catalogued every detail. The way Lady Worthington's fingers tightened on her glass when Colonel Mercer spoke, the nervous habit young James had of adjusting his cufflinks, the manner in which Dr. Hartwell watched their host with professional concern. "I confess, Sir Reginald," the detective said during a lull in the conversation, "I am curious as to what brings such a distinguished gathering together on this autumn evening." Their host's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "Why, the pleasure of good company, of course. Though I admit, Monsieur Poirot, that your reputation for, shall we say, unraveling complex situations, was not unknown to me when I extended the invitation." The grandfather clock in the hall chose that moment to strike the half-hour, its deep chimes rolling through the manor like a bronze-throated warning. As the sound faded, the detective caught something in the silence that followed, a tension that seemed to grip each guest like a physical thing. "Time," Sir Reginald murmured, almost to himself. "How curious that we measure our lives by such arbitrary divisions, minutes, hours, all marching toward some inevitable conclusion." Dinner, when it was announced, promised to be an interesting affair indeed. Chapter 2: Dinner with the Dead. The dining room at Thornfield Manor was a testament to generations of Ashworth prosperity. Portraits of stern ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow the guests as they took their appointed places around a mahogany table that could have seated twice their number. Sir Reginald had positioned himself at the head of the table with the skill of a general arranging his forces. Lady Worthington sat to his right, her nephew James beside her, while Colonel Mercer occupied the place of honour to their host's left. Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell were seated across from each other in the middle of the table, with the detective and Hastings completing the arrangement. As the first course was served, a delicate consommé that spoke of a talented cook in the kitchens below, conversation flowed with the practiced ease of people accustomed to such gatherings. Yet beneath the surface politeness, the little Belgian detected currents of tension that made the very air seem to thicken. "I was most interested to read of your recent business ventures in the Times, Sir Reginald," Lady Worthington remarked, her tone carrying just the faintest hint of disapproval. "Expanding into manufacturing seems rather modern for a family with such traditional values." Their host's knife paused over his fish. "Times change, Margaret. The war taught us all that clinging too tightly to the past can be fatal. One must adapt or perish." "Spoken like a true businessman," Colonel Mercer interjected, though his smile held no warmth. "I recall you were always quick to recognize opportunities even during our time in France." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we might discuss more pleasant topics. The weather has been remarkably mild for October." "Indeed," young James Worthington agreed eagerly, his fingers working at his cufflinks in a nervous gesture the detective had noted earlier. "Perfect for shooting, though I understand the gamekeeper has been reporting some unusual activity on the grounds recently." Sir Reginald's fork clattered against his plate. "What sort of activity? Or probably nothing significant. Poachers most likely, though Henderson swears he's seen figures moving about after dark. Could be hikers of course, or perhaps someone taking shelter in the old groundskeeper's cottage." The detective's interest sharpened. Throughout the evening, he had been cataloguing the small details that others might overlook, the way Mrs. Hartwell's hand trembled slightly when she lifted her wineglass, the manner in which Colonel Mercer's eyes never quite met their host's, the nervous energy that radiated from young Worthington like heat from a fire. But it was their host himself who proved most fascinating. Sir Reginald Ashworth was a man walking a tightrope, maintaining his facade of gracious hospitality, while some inner tension wound tighter with each passing moment. His attempts at casual conversation felt forced, and more than once the detective caught him glancing at the ornate clock that stood in the corner of the dining room. As the main course was cleared away, roast beef that had been carved with military precision, Sir Reginald rose from his place. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I have a small matter to attend to in my study. Please, continue without me. The sweet course should arrive shortly." He departed through the door that led to the main hall, leaving behind a silence that seemed to expand like ripples in a pond. It was Lady Worthington who broke it first. "Really, Reginald has been quite odd this evening, don't you think so, Edmund?" Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. "He has seemed somewhat preoccupied recently. Nothing serious, I'm sure, but perhaps the pressures of business." "Business," Colonel Mercer repeated, his voice carrying a bitter edge. Yes, Reggie was always talented at business, particularly when it came to knowing which way the wind was blowing. The detective's ears pricked at the tone. Here was a man nursing old wounds, possibly grievances that went deeper than mere business rivalry. The war had ended 5 years ago, yet for some it seemed, the battles continued in drawing rooms and dining halls. Young James Worthington attempted to lighten the mood. "I say, Monsieur Poirot, we've all read about your famous cases in the newspapers. That business with the Orient Express was absolutely thrilling. Do you ever find yourself missing the excitement when you're between investigations?" "Ah, but you assume, mon ami, that Hercule Poirot is ever truly between investigations. The human heart, she is always a mystery, and where there are people, there are secrets waiting to be uncovered." Mrs. Hartwell looked up from her untouched dessert. "How dreadful it must be to always suspect the worst of people." "On the contrary, madame, I have found that understanding the worst in people helps one to appreciate the best. We all carry shadows, non? The question is whether we allow them to consume us, or whether we choose to step into the light." As if summoned by his words, the grandfather clock in the hall began its sonorous count of 9 o'clock. The bronze chimes rolled through the manor like the voice of time itself, marking another hour in the endless procession of mortality. It was then, in the silence that followed the 9th chime, that they heard it, a sharp crack that could have been a door slamming, or a motor car backfiring, but which sent a chill through every person in the room. "What was that?" Mrs. Hartwell whispered. "Doctor." Hartwell was already rising from his chair. It sounded as though it came from the direction of the study. The detective's blood quickened as his instincts, honed by years of experience, began to sound their silent alarm. In the space of a heartbeat, he had risen and was moving toward the door, the others following in his wake like ships in the slipstream of a destroyer. They found Sir Reginald Ashworth slumped over his desk in the study, a small revolver lying beside his right hand. The French windows stood open to the October night, and a cool breeze stirred the papers scattered across the leather writing surface. "Mon Dieu," the detective breathed, but already his eyes were cataloguing the scene with the precision of a camera. The position of the body, the angle of the wound, the placement of the weapon, all would tell their story to one who knew how to listen. Dr. Hartwell pushed past him to check for signs of life, though they all knew it was futile. When he looked up, his face was grave. "He's dead. The wound appears to be to the right temple. I would estimate the time of death at approximately 9:15. The detective's eyes found the clock on the mantelpiece, which showed 23 minutes past 9. 8 minutes had elapsed since they heard the sound, yet something about the scene troubled his orderly mind. "Has anyone touched anything?" he asked sharply. The assembled guests shook their heads, all struck dumb by the sudden transformation from dinner party to tragedy. "Très bien. Then we must call the police immediately, and until they arrive, nothing in this room must be disturbed." Yet even as he spoke, the detective's keen gaze was memorizing every detail of the scene, for in his experience first impressions were often the most valuable, and something about this apparent suicide struck him as profoundly wrong. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, and in that moment, Hercule Poirot knew that time itself would be the key to unraveling this mystery. Chapter 3. The inconsistent clock. The local constabulary arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Meadows, a competent man whose rural jurisdiction rarely required him to investigate anything more complex than poaching or petty theft. He surveyed the study with the methodical attention of one who had learned not to jump to conclusions, though the evidence seemed to point in only one direction. "Appears straightforward enough," he murmured to the detective after completing his initial examination. "Single gunshot wound to the right temple, weapon found beside the body, powder burns consistent with close contact. The French windows were open, suggesting he may have been contemplating his options before he made his final decision." The detective nodded thoughtfully, though his eyes continued to study the scene with an intensity that made the inspector slightly uncomfortable. You have experience with such cases, Inspector, a few regrettably, more common than people like to admit, especially among men of a certain age who faced financial difficulties or personal troubles. The war left many scars, as I'm sure you understand, indeed, and you have established the time of death. Dr. Hartwell places it at approximately 9:15, which matches what the guests heard from the dining room. Seems Sir Reginald excused himself from dinner, came to his study, and, well, ended his troubles. But the detective was not satisfied with such neat conclusions. His attention had been drawn to several details that troubled his orderly mind, chief among them the behavior of the grandfather clock that dominated the entrance hall. Tell me, Inspector, what do you make of this timepiece? They stood before the magnificent clock, its brass pendulum catching the light from the electric fixtures that had been installed throughout the manor. The clock face showed 10:47, and its mechanism ticked with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Beautiful piece. German works, I'd say, though the case is English craftsmanship, probably worth a considerable sum. And you notice nothing unusual about its timekeeping? Inspector Meadows checked his pocket watch and frowned. It appears to be running approximately 3 minutes slow, though that's hardly unusual for a clock of this age. The detective's green eyes gleamed. Ah, but there you are wrong, mon ami. Earlier this evening when we arrived, I observed this same clock. At that time, it showed the correct hour and minute with perfect precision. I make it my habit to note such details, you understand, as time is often crucial in matters of life and death. Are you suggesting someone tampered with the clock? I am suggesting, Inspector, that we should not be too hasty in our conclusions. A clock that keeps perfect time does not suddenly begin to lose 3 minutes without cause. The inspector looked skeptical, but the detective had already moved on to other concerns. He requested permission to interview each of the dinner guests individually, a request that Meadows granted with some reluctance. Lady Worthington was the first to be questioned, and she settled herself in the morning room with the composed dignity of one accustomed to being consulted on matters of importance. Such a dreadful business, Monsieur Poirot, though I must confess, I was not entirely surprised. Reginald had seemed troubled recently. There were rumors, you understand, about his business affairs. What sort of rumors, madame? Oh, nothing concrete, but one hears whispers. The shipping industry has been difficult since the war ended, and there were stories about some of his wartime contracts being investigated by the authorities. The detective made careful notes. You have known Sir Reginald for many years, since we were children actually. Our families were neighbors, and we moved in the same circles. He was always ambitious, even as a boy, though, she paused as if weighing her words. Though what, madame? Though he was not always scrupulous about how he achieved his ambitions. During the war, there were certain irregularities in his business dealings that concerned those of us who knew him well. Young James Worthington proved equally informative when his turn came. The nervous energy that had characterized him throughout dinner seemed even more pronounced in the intimate setting of a private interview. Uncle Reggie invited us rather suddenly, he explained, his fingers working at those troublesome cufflinks. Aunt Margaret was surprised to receive the invitation, as they hadn't spoken in several months following a disagreement about business matters. What sort of disagreement? I'm not entirely certain of the details, but it concerned some property investments that went badly. Aunt Margaret had recommended he avoid certain ventures, but Uncle Reggie proceeded anyway. The losses were substantial, and she felt he had ignored her advice out of masculine pride. The detective observed the young man's nervous habits with growing interest. You seem somewhat agitated, Monsieur Worthington. The evening's events have distressed you. Well, naturally, it's not every day one dines with a man who subsequently, I mean to say, it's rather shocking, isn't it? But there was something in the young man's manner that suggested his agitation preceded the discovery of Sir Reginald's body. The detective filed this observation away for future consideration. Dr. Hartwell and his wife were interviewed together at their request, and their account provided additional pieces to the puzzle. The doctor had known Sir Reginald for nearly a decade, serving as both family physician and occasional dinner companion. He consulted me professionally just last week, Dr. Hartwell admitted. Nothing serious, some trouble with sleeping, complaints of nervous exhaustion. I prescribed a mild sedative and advised him to reduce his business activities. The war had left him changed, as it did so many men of his generation. Mrs. Hartwell nodded agreement.
He seemed to carry such a weight on his shoulders. Sarah always said he looked like a man haunted by his past. Did he speak of any specific concerns, threats perhaps, or fears for his safety? The doctor shook his head. Nothing of that nature. His troubles seemed to be of a financial and emotional character rather than physical danger. But it was Colonel Mercer who provided the most intriguing testimony. The military man's bearing remained rigid throughout the interview, yet there was an undercurrent of satisfaction in his manner that the detective found distinctly troubling. Reggie Ashworth was a complex man, Monsieur Poirot, charming when it suited him, ruthless when it served his purposes. We served together in France during the final year of the war, and I learned things about his character that perhaps others never saw. What sort of things, Colonel? The sort that make a man's death less surprising than it might otherwise be. Reggie had a talent for surviving when better men perished, and that talent often came at the expense of others. The detective pressed for specifics, but the colonel proved evasive, claiming that military discretion prevented him from being more explicit about wartime events. As the interviews concluded, and the guests were allowed to retire to the rooms prepared for them, the detective found himself standing once again before the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Its steady ticking seemed to mock his efforts to understand the evening's events, yet he felt certain that within its brass mechanisms lay a crucial clue to the truth. Time, he murmured to his faithful companion, is the one witness that cannot lie, Hastings, yet someone in this house has attempted to make it do exactly that. Chapter 4, The Testimony of Objects. Dawn crept across the Hampshire countryside like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows through the tall windows of Thornfield Manor. The detective had slept little, his mind turning over the events of the previous evening like a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. There were too many inconsistencies, too many elements that refused to align themselves into the neat pattern of suicide that Inspector Meadows seemed determined to accept. After a hasty breakfast with the other guests, a subdued affair where conversation was limited to requests for marmalade and observations about the weather, the detective requested another opportunity to examine the study. The inspector grudgingly agreed, though he clearly considered it a waste of time. Mind you, don't disturb anything, Monsieur Poirot. The coroner will want everything left exactly as we found it. But the detective had no intention of disturbing the scene. Instead, he employed what he privately called his method of silent observation, allowing his eyes to absorb every detail while his mind catalogued the significance of each element. The study was a masculine room, lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive oak desk that had clearly seen decades of use. Sir Reginald's body had been removed, but the outline of his final position was still visible in the way papers had been scattered and the chair positioned. Hastings, observe the pattern of these documents. What do you see? His companion studied the desk carefully. Well, they appear to be legal papers of some sort, a will by the look of it, and, good heavens, some sort of military correspondence. Press a cement, and notice how they are arranged. The will is dated yesterday. Sir Reginald revised it just yesterday morning, and these military documents. The detective's eyes narrowed as he studied the official letterhead. These are from the War Office, correspondence regarding an investigation into certain supply contracts during 1918. The significance of the timing was not lost on either man. Sir Reginald had rewritten his will on the very day of the dinner party, and the military investigation letters suggested that his wartime activities were under official scrutiny. But it was another detail that captured the detective's attention, a small inconsistency that would have been invisible to a casual observer. On the floor beside the desk lay a linen napkin, monogrammed with the Ashworth family crest. It was unstained and appeared to have been dropped rather than thrown. Most curious, Hastings, why would a man contemplating suicide bring a dinner napkin to his study? And observe how it lies, not crumpled or twisted as it would be if Sir Reginald had used it to wipe his hands or face, but folded as if it had been placed carefully, and then disturbed. They continued their examination, and the detective's sharp eyes noted several other anomalies. The French windows were indeed open, as Inspector Meadows had observed, but the curtains had not been disturbed by the October breeze. This suggested they had been opened only recently, perhaps after the shooting rather than before. More intriguing still was the position of the revolver. While it lay beside Sir Reginald's right hand in a position consistent with suicide, the detective noted that the weapon's barrel was pointing away from the body rather than toward it, an unusual detail for a man who had supposedly just fired it into his own temple. Inspector Meadows assumes that Sir Reginald opened the windows to contemplate his decision, the detective murmured thoughtfully. But if that were the case, why are there no signs that he stood by them? The carpet shows no impressions, and the curtains remain undisturbed. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Meadows himself, accompanied by a small precise man carrying a leather bag. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, allow me to present Dr. Thornbury, the police surgeon. He's here to conduct a more thorough examination of the deceased." Dr. Thornbury proved to be a meticulous professional whose initial findings confirmed Dr. Hartwell's preliminary assessment. The wound was indeed to the right temple, caused by a single shot at close range. However, his more detailed examination revealed several points of interest. The powder burns are consistent with the weapon being held approximately 6 inches from the point of contact, he explained, not pressed directly against the temple, as one might expect in a typical suicide, but at a slight distance. The detective's eyebrows rose. 6 inches, you say? Most interesting. And the angle of the wound? Slightly downward, which is consistent with the victim being seated when the shot was fired. However, the surgeon paused, consulting his notes. The blood spatter pattern is somewhat unusual. While most of it conforms to what one would expect, there are several drops on the desk blotter that suggest a different trajectory than the primary wound would indicate. Inspector Meadows looked annoyed. "Are you suggesting this wasn't suicide, Doctor?" "I'm simply reporting my observations, Inspector. The evidence is consistent with suicide, but there are certain anomalies that warrant careful consideration." The detective requested permission to examine the weapon itself, and Dr. Thornbury obligingly produced the revolver from his evidence bag. It was a service revolver of the type commonly carried by officers during the war, well maintained despite its age. "Observe, mon ami," the detective said to Hastings. "The grip bears the impression of fingers, but notice how they are positioned. The thumbprint here, the finger impressions there, they suggest the weapon was held in a most unusual manner for suicide." But their examination was interrupted by a commotion from the main hall. Raised voices echoed through the corridors, and they hurried to investigate the disturbance. They found Lady Worthington engaged in a heated discussion with her nephew James, their voices carrying the particular intensity of a family dispute that had been building for some time. "Absolutely will not stand for it, James. The very idea that you would suggest such a thing about poor Reginald shows a complete lack of propriety. But Aunt Margaret, surely you must see that his invitation last night was hardly coincidental. He knew about the investigation, knew that questions were being asked about those supply contracts." "Lower your voice this instant," Lady Worthington hissed, suddenly aware of their audience. "Such matters are not to be discussed in public." The detective approached with his characteristic diplomatic manner. "Forgive the intrusion, but I could not help overhearing mention of an investigation. Might this relate to the military correspondence we observed in Sir Reginald's study?"
Lady Worthington's face flushed, but before she could respond, her nephew answered with the reckless honesty of youth. "There have been questions raised about certain supply contracts that Uncle Reggie negotiated during the final year of the war. Nothing formal, you understand, but enough to cause concern among those who knew him then." The detective filed this information away, noting the interesting fact that both the revised will and the military investigation seemed to converge on the same point in time, the dinner party that had ended so tragically. As the morning progressed, he found himself drawn repeatedly to the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Its steady ticking seemed to mock his efforts to understand the sequence of events, yet he felt certain that within its mechanical precision lay the key to unraveling the entire mystery. "Time, Hastings," he murmured to his companion. "Someone has attempted to manipulate time itself, and until we understand how and why, we shall never arrive at the truth." Chapter 5. The Weight of Silence. The afternoon brought with it an unexpected visitor to Thornfield Manor. Henderson, the gamekeeper whom James Worthington had mentioned the previous evening, arrived at the servants' entrance requesting to speak with someone in authority about the tragic events. Henderson was a man carved from the English countryside itself, weathered by decades of outdoor work, with hands that spoke of intimate knowledge of shotguns and snares. His face bore the particular gravity that comes from being the bearer of uncomfortable news. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said to Inspector Meadows, "but I thought you should know about what I seen last night, what with Sir Reginald being found dead and all." The detective immediately requested permission to be present during Henderson's statement, a request the inspector granted with visible reluctance. "Well then, Henderson, what did you observe?" The gamekeeper removed his cap and worked it nervously in his hands. "It were about 8:30, sir, when I seen someone moving about near the old groundskeeper's cottage. Thought it might be poachers, so I went to investigate. But whoever it were, they'd scarpered by the time I got close enough to get a proper look." "Could you determine anything about this person? Height, build, clothing?" "Well, that's the odd thing, sir. They seemed to know the grounds quite well, moved through the trees without making much noise, avoided the paths where the gravel would crunch underfoot. This weren't no casual trespasser, if you take my meaning." The detective leaned forward with interest. "And what time did you say this occurred?" 8:30 by my watch, sir, though I'll admit, it's not the most reliable timepiece. But I'd just finished my evening rounds of the pheasant pens, and I always do those at the same time each day." Inspector Meadows made notes, though his expression suggested he considered this information of minimal importance. "Probably just coincidence, Henderson. Could have been anyone, a hiker who lost his way perhaps." But the detective was not satisfied with such easy dismissals. "This cottage you mention, it lies in which direction from the main house?" "Southwest, sir, about a quarter mile through the woods. Been empty for the better part of 2 years now, ever since old Weatherby retired. We use it for storage mostly though." Henderson paused as if weighing whether to continue. "Though what?" "Well, sir, when I checked it this morning the door was standing open. Could have been the wind, I suppose, but I could have sworn I locked it proper when I stored the autumn feed there last week." The detective exchanged glances with Hastings. Here was another piece of the puzzle, though its significance remained unclear. He requested directions to the cottage and permission to examine it, despite Inspector Meadows' obvious skepticism about the value of such an excursion. The walk through the woods of Thornfield took them along winding paths that spoke of centuries of use. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral of shadows even in the afternoon light. The detective noted the soft earth underfoot, which would preserve footprints admirably, yet their path showed only the expected traces of Henderson's morning visit. The groundskeeper's cottage proved to be a modest stone building, its windows dark and unwelcoming. As Henderson had reported, the front door stood ajar, though whether by design or accident remained unclear. "Observe, Hastings, how the door hangs. See those scratches around the lock mechanism. Someone has been here recently, and they were either very skilled with locks or very desperate." The interior of the cottage was spartanly furnished, a few pieces of rough furniture and shelves lined with the detritus of estate management. But the detective's attention was immediately drawn to signs of recent occupation. A thin layer of dust disturbed on the wooden table, ashes in the fireplace that were too fresh for the cottage's supposed abandonment, and most tellingly, a small pile of papers tucked behind one of the storage barrels. "Mon Dieu, what have we here?" The papers proved to be correspondence, though not of the sort one might expect to find in a gamekeeper's cottage. They were letters addressed to Colonel Anthony Mercer, care of a London club, and their content made for fascinating reading. "Hastings, listen to this. My dear Tony, I trust you will reconsider your position regarding the Marseille incident. What happened in 1918 was war, and we all made difficult decisions. To rake up such matters now serves no one's interests, least of all your own. It is signed clearly Sir Reginald Ashworth." But there were other letters, and their tone grew progressively more urgent, even threatening. The final one, dated just 3 days before the dinner party, was particularly revealing. "Tony, your persistence in this matter leaves me no choice but to consider more decisive action. Some secrets are best left buried with those who carried them. I suggest you remember that when making your decisions about the future, the implications were staggering." Here was clear evidence of some wartime incident, the Marseille incident, that connected Sir Reginald and Colonel Mercer in a web of shared secrets and mutual threats. The cottage had apparently served as a meeting place or dead drop for their correspondence, hidden away from the prying eyes of servants or family members. But why, mused Hastings, would Colonel Mercer leave such incriminating evidence in an abandoned cottage? Surely he would have retrieved or destroyed such letters. But consider the alternative, mon ami. Perhaps the colonel never had the opportunity to retrieve them. Perhaps events moved faster than he anticipated. They continued their search and discovered additional evidence of the cottage's recent use: a few cigarette butts of an expensive brand, a wine bottle that bore the label of Sir Reginald's own cellars, and most intriguingly, a pocket watch that had stopped at exactly 9 o'clock. The watch was of fine workmanship, gold with an engraved case, and when the detective opened it, he found an inscription: "To A.M. with gratitude for services rendered. Ray 1918, Anthony Mercer." Breathed Hastings, "a gift from Sir Reginald during the war." Indeed, and notice the time at which it stopped: exactly 9 o'clock, not 9:15, when Sir Reginald is supposed to have died, but 9 o'clock precisely. The detective's mind raced with the implications: the stopped watch, the letters, the evidence of recent occupation, all pointed to a complex relationship between Sir Reginald and Colonel Mercer that went far beyond casual acquaintance. As they prepared to return to the main house, the detective took one final look around the cottage. His eye was caught by something that had been hidden beneath the scattered papers, a small object that glinted in the afternoon light filtering through the dirty windows. It was a cufflink, ornate and expensive, bearing the same monogram that had adorned young James Worthington's shirt during dinner the previous evening. "Curious and curiouser," murmured the detective, carefully wrapping the cufflink in his handkerchief. "It would appear that our young Monsieur Worthington has also been a visitor to this remote cottage. The question remains, when, and for what purpose?" The walk back to Thornfield Manor was conducted in thoughtful silence, both men absorbed in contemplating the significance of their discoveries. The cottage had yielded far more than they had expected, transforming what appeared to be a straightforward suicide into something far more complex and sinister. Upon their return, they found the house in a state of subdued activity. The coroner had completed his preliminary examination, and the guests were being informed that they would be free to return to London the following morning, pending any further developments in the investigation. The detective requested a private word with Inspector Meadows, sharing their discoveries at the cottage, while carefully omitting certain details that he preferred to pursue independently. "Letters, you say, and this watch belonging to Colonel Mercer." The inspector examined the timepiece with professional interest. "Certainly adds a new dimension to the case, though I'm not sure it changes the fundamental conclusion. Men with guilty secrets often choose suicide over exposure." "Perhaps, Inspector. But tell me, have you had opportunity to examine the dining room more thoroughly? I am particularly interested in the napkins from last evening's meal." Inspector Meadows looked puzzled by this seemingly trivial request, but he accompanied the detective to the dining room where the table had been cleared but not yet reset. The linens from the previous evening had been gathered by the servants and lay folded on the sideboard awaiting laundering. The detective examined each napkin with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. Most bore the expected stains of a formal dinner: wine, gravy, the occasional drop of sauce. But one napkin was conspicuously cleaner than the others, bearing only the faintest traces of use. "This napkin, Inspector, it corresponds to the place setting where Colonel Mercer sat last evening. Notice how little soiled it appears compared to the others. Either the Colonel is remarkably fastidious in his dining habits, or what? Or he had occasion to remove his napkin from the dining room before the meal was concluded, perhaps to attend to some urgent business elsewhere in the house." The detective's theory was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hartwell, who appeared agitated and requested a private consultation with Inspector Meadows. "I've been thinking about last evening's events," the doctor began, glancing nervously at the detective. "There's something I should have mentioned earlier, but in the shock of the moment it slipped my mind." "What sort of something, doctor?" "It concerns the timing of events. You see, I have a habit of checking my pocket watch regularly, a professional necessity, you understand, for timing pulses and such. When we heard the sound from Sir Reginald's study, I automatically noted the time." Inspector Meadows leaned forward with interest. "And, according to my watch, it was precisely 9:17, not 9:15 as I initially stated, but 17 minutes past. I realize the difference seems insignificant, but accuracy in such matters." The detective's eyes gleamed with satisfaction.
Au contraire, doctor, the difference is most significant indeed. 2 minutes may seem trivial, but in matters of life and death they can be the difference between truth and deception. As the afternoon wore on, the detective found himself drawn once again to the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Its steady ticking had resumed its normal rhythm, the 3-minute discrepancy apparently corrected during the night. Yet this very correction seemed to confirm his growing suspicions about the manipulation of time. Hastings, I believe we are approaching the crux of this mystery. Someone in this house has gone to considerable lengths to obscure the true sequence of events, using time itself as their weapon. But like all deceptions, it contains within it the seeds of its own discovery. The evening meal was a subdued affair, with most of the guests maintaining the polite but distant manner appropriate to a house in mourning. Yet the detective's trained eye detected undercurrents of tension that suggested not all of the dinner party's secrets had been revealed. Colonel Mercer appeared particularly withdrawn, speaking only when directly addressed and consuming little of the excellent roast prepared by the kitchen staff. Young James Worthington seemed if anything more nervous than before, his habit of adjusting his remaining cufflink now so pronounced as to be almost compulsive. It was Lady Worthington who provided the evening's most revealing moment. As coffee was being served in the drawing room, she approached the detective with the air of one who had reached a difficult decision. "Monsieur Poirot, I wonder if I might speak with you privately. There are certain matters, family matters, that perhaps should be brought to light in view of recent events." They retired to the morning room, where Lady Worthington seated herself with the rigid posture of one preparing to perform an unpleasant duty. "What I am about to tell you must be treated with the utmost discretion. It concerns my nephew James and certain financial difficulties that have plagued him recently." The detective's interest sharpened. "What sort of difficulties, madame?" "James has developed rather expensive tastes since returning from university. Gaming debts primarily, though there have been other extravagances as well. The amounts involved are substantial, and Sir Reginald was aware of these debts." Lady Worthington nodded reluctantly. Reginald had agreed to settle them, but only under certain conditions. James was to reform his habits, accept a position in one of Reginald's business ventures, and submit to a period of, shall we say, supervised rehabilitation. And your nephew's response to these conditions? He was not pleased. Young men rarely appreciate having their freedom curtailed, even when it is for their own benefit. There were harsh words between them, and James made certain statements that he now deeply regrets. The detective made careful note of this revelation. Here was another motive, another thread in the increasingly complex web of relationships and secrets that surrounded Sir Reginald Ashworth's death. As Lady Worthington concluded her testimony and departed for her room, the detective remained in the morning room, contemplating the growing list of suspects and motives. Colonel Mercer with his wartime secrets, James Worthington with his financial desperation, even Lady Worthington herself with her family pride and protective instincts. Yet something continued to trouble him about the fundamental question of timing. The grandfather clock, the stopped pocket watch, Dr. Hartwell's revised estimate of when the shot was heard, all suggested that someone had attempted to manipulate the perceived sequence of events. "Time, mon ami," he murmured to his reflection in the darkened window, "is the one witness that cannot lie. Yet someone has tried to make it do exactly that. The question is not just who killed Sir Reginald Ashworth, but who dared to steal time itself in service of murder." Chapter 6. The Silent Witness. The third morning at Thornfield Manor dawned grey and misty, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seems to seep into one's very bones. The detective had spent a restless night, his mind turning over the accumulating evidence like a scholar examining fragments of an ancient text, searching for the pattern that would make sense of the whole. He had risen early and made his way to the study, where Inspector Meadows was concluding his official investigation with the methodical thoroughness of a man determined to leave no procedural stone unturned. "I believe we can close this case with confidence, Monsieur Poirot," the inspector announced as he sealed the last of his evidence bags. "Suicide while of unsound mind, brought on by financial difficulties and the pressure of military investigation. The coroner will undoubtedly reach the same conclusion. And yet, Inspector, there remain certain inconsistencies that trouble the logical mind, such as, the detective had prepared for this moment, marshalling his arguments with the precision of a legal advocate. Consider, if you will, the matter of the dinner napkin found in this room. Why would a man contemplating suicide bring such an item from the dining room, and observe the position in which it was found, folded, not crumpled as it would be if used to wipe one's hands or face? Inspector Meadows examined the napkin with reluctant interest. Perhaps he used it to handle the revolver, to avoid leaving fingerprints. An intriguing theory, but the weapon bears clear prints consistent with Sir Reginald's grip. No, mon ami, this napkin serves some other purpose, though what that purpose might be requires further consideration. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Henderson, the gamekeeper, who appeared even more agitated than during his previous visit. Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but I've found something else you ought to see. Down by the old cottage, in the brambles behind the building, looks like someone tried to hide it, but the rain last night washed away some of the covering. They followed Henderson through the dripping woods to the abandoned cottage, where he led them to a thick patch of blackberry brambles some 20 yards behind the building. There, partially concealed beneath a hastily constructed covering of branches and leaves, lay a leather traveling bag of expensive manufacture. The bag bore no external identification, but its contents proved illuminating. Inside were a complete change of clothing, including a dark overcoat and hat that would render the wearer nearly invisible in the evening shadows, as well as a small leather notebook filled with what appeared to be surveillance notes. Observe Hastings, these entries. Retires to study at 8:45 each evening. Butler completes rounds at 9:30. French windows remain unlocked until final security check. This is the work of someone who has been watching Thornfield Manor for some time, cataloguing the habits of its occupants. But it was the final item in the bag that proved most significant, a military decoration in a small velvet case, bearing the inscription, Captain O. Mercer, Distinguished Service Order, 1918. Inspector Meadows examined the medal with professional interest. Belongs to Colonel Mercer, obviously. Question is, what was it doing hidden in the woods? The detective's mind raced with the implications. Perhaps, Inspector, we should ask the Colonel himself. They found Colonel Mercer in the library, ostensibly reading but clearly distracted. When confronted with the evidence of the hidden bag and its contents, his military bearing seemed to falter for the first time since their arrival at Thornfield. I can explain, he began, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Please do, the detective replied gently. We are most interested in your explanation. The Colonel rose and walked to the window, where he stood with his back to them for several long moments. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed guilt. Reggie Ashworth was not the war hero that people believed him to be. He was a profiteer, a man who grew rich while better men died. The Marseille incident, that you've undoubtedly read about in those letters, it involved a supply convoy that Reggie deliberately misdirected to serve his own financial interests. And the result? 37 men died because the medical supplies they desperately needed never arrived. 37 good soldiers, who might have lived if Reggie hadn't seen an opportunity to increase his profit margins by selling those supplies to French civilians at inflated prices. The detective made careful notes. And you have carried this knowledge for 7 years. I promised those dying men that someday somehow justice would be served. When I learned that the War Office was finally investigating Reggie's wartime contracts, I saw my chance. I came here to confront him, to demand that he confess his crimes publicly. But something went wrong with your plan. Colonel Mercer turned back to face them, his eyes haunted by memories. Reggie laughed at me, said that the dead couldn't testify, and that I had no proof that would stand up in court. He was right, of course. All the documentation had been conveniently lost or destroyed years ago. Inspector Meadows leaned forward. So you decided to take justice into your own hands? No, the denial came with explosive force. Whatever else I may be, I am not a murderer. Yes, I prepared for the possibility of direct action. The bag you found contained contingency supplies in case I needed to disappear quickly, but I never used them. The detective studied the Colonel's face with the intensity of a physician examining symptoms. Yet you were absent from the dining room during the crucial period. The napkin from your place setting shows minimal use, suggesting you left the table before the meal was completed. Colonel Mercer's shoulders sagged in defeat. I went to the cottage to retrieve my letters and destroy the evidence of my surveillance activities. I knew the investigation would focus on me once Reggie's death became public, and I couldn't afford to have those materials discovered. And what time was this? Just after 9 o'clock. I was returning to the house when I heard the gunshot. By the time I reached the dining room, everyone was already rushing toward the study. The detective made additional notes, though something in the Colonel's story continued to trouble him. The timeline as presented seemed plausible, yet there remained gaps that required explanation. This cottage, Colonel, you met with Sir Reginald there previously, several times over the past month. It provided privacy for our negotiations. Reggie was hoping to convince me to abandon my quest for justice, while I was trying to persuade him to confess voluntarily. Inspector Meadows seemed satisfied with this explanation, but the detective had additional questions. The matter of the stopped pocket watch, for instance, remained unresolved. If the Colonel had indeed been at the cottage at 9 o'clock, why had his watch stopped at precisely that time? Your pocket watch, Colonel, the one we found at the cottage, it shows 9 o'clock exactly. How do you account for this? For the first time, Colonel Mercer appeared genuinely puzzled. My watch? But I have my watch right here. He produced a silver timepiece from his waistcoat pocket. I haven't been to the cottage since Tuesday evening, when Reggie and I had our final discussion. The detective's eyebrows rose. If Colonel Mercer's watch was in his possession, then whose watch had they found at the cottage? The gold watch with its inscription, "To AM, with gratitude for services rendered," had clearly been intended for Anthony Mercer, but apparently it had never been in his possession. This gift from Sir Reginald, the gold watch, you never received it. Reggie offered it to me after the Marseille incident, along with other inducements to ensure my silence. I refused them all. The watch may still be in his possession, for all I know. Here was another piece of the puzzle, though its significance remained unclear. Someone had placed Colonel Mercer's intended gift at the cottage, someone who wanted it to be found and connected to the Colonel's presence there. As the morning progressed, the detective found himself increasingly convinced that the apparent suicide of Sir Reginald Ashworth was in fact an elaborate murder designed to look like self-destruction. The manipulated timing, the planted evidence, the careful arrangement of motives and suspects, all pointed to a killer of considerable intelligence and planning ability. But which of the dinner guests possessed both the means and the opportunity to commit such a crime? Colonel Mercer had motive but a plausible alibi. Young James Worthington had financial desperation, but seemed too nervous and inexperienced for such sophisticated deception. Lady Worthington had family honor to protect but seemed genuinely shocked by her host's death. Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell remained wild cards in the investigation. The doctor's medical knowledge would certainly be useful in staging a convincing suicide, and his revision of the time estimate suggested possible manipulation of the evidence. Yet what motive could a family physician have for murdering his patient? As he pondered these questions, the detective's attention was once again drawn to the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Its steady ticking seemed to mock his efforts to understand the true sequence of events, yet he remained convinced that within its mechanical precision lay the key to solving the entire mystery. Time, he murmured to himself, is the one constant in this equation. Everything else may be subject to deception, but time itself cannot lie, unless someone forces it to do so. Chapter 7, The Mechanics of Deception. That afternoon brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to unraveling the mystery. Dr. Thornbury, the police surgeon, returned to Thornfield Manor with additional findings from his examination of Sir Reginald's body, findings that cast serious doubt on the suicide theory that Inspector Meadows had been so eager to accept. I've completed a more thorough analysis of the wound patterns and blood spatter, Dr. Thornbury explained as he spread his notes across the dining room table. While the evidence is consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot, there are several anomalies that require explanation. The detective leaned forward with keen interest. What sort of anomalies, Doctor? First, the angle of the bullet's trajectory. While possible for suicide, it would require Sir Reginald to hold the weapon in an extremely awkward position. Most individuals, when contemplating such an act, choose the temple or the mouth, direct, instinctive placements that require minimal conscious thought about angles and trajectories. Inspector Meadows looked skeptical. Are you suggesting the wound was inflicted by another person? I'm suggesting that the physical evidence raises questions that deserve careful consideration. Additionally, I found traces of an unusual substance on the victim's hands and clothing, something that initially appeared to be gunpowder residue, but proved on closer examination to be something quite different.
Dr. Thornbury produced a small vial containing what appeared to be fine grey powder. This substance has properties consistent with graphite mixed with lamp black, the sort of mixture one might use to simulate powder burns artificially. The implications were staggering. If someone had indeed applied artificial powder residue to Sir Reginald's hands and clothing, it suggested an elaborate attempt to disguise murder as suicide. There's more, Dr. Thornbury continued. The victim's clothing shows evidence of having been rearranged post-mortem, small tears in the fabric that don't correspond to any damage from the gunshot, and creasing patterns that suggest the body was moved and repositioned after death. The detective's mind raced with the possibilities. Here was confirmation of his suspicions. Sir Reginald Ashworth had indeed been murdered, and his killer had gone to considerable lengths to make it appear otherwise. Doctor, in your professional opinion, how long would such staging require? Given the complexity of the scene arrangement, I would estimate at least 10 to 15 minutes, possibly longer if the perpetrator was being particularly careful about details. This timeline was crucial to understanding the crime. If the killer required 15 minutes to stage the scene, then Sir Reginald must have been killed well before the gunshot that the dinner guests heard from the dining room. The detective requested permission to examine the grandfather clock more closely, bringing with him a small toolkit that he habitually carried for just such occasions. Inspector Meadows watched with growing puzzlement as the little Belgian began carefully examining the clock's mechanism. Aha, just as I suspected, mon ami. Observe this small lever here, hidden behind the main pendulum assembly. It is designed to temporarily halt the clock's mechanism, a feature commonly included in high-quality timepieces to facilitate adjustment and maintenance. And the significance, Inspector, is that someone used this lever to stop the clock at approximately 9 o'clock, then released it to resume normal timekeeping. The purpose was to create confusion about the actual time of death. Inspector Meadows examined the mechanism himself, though his understanding of clockwork was clearly limited. But why would the killer want to confuse the timing? Because, mon ami, the killer needed additional time to stage the scene properly. By stopping the clock, and then creating the sound of a gunshot at the expected time, they established an alibi while simultaneously providing themselves with the necessary minutes to arrange Sir Reginald's body and plant the various pieces of evidence. The detective's theory was interrupted by the arrival of young James Worthington, who appeared even more agitated than usual. The nervous energy that had characterized him throughout their stay at Thornfield had reached a fever pitch, and his hands shook visibly as he approached them. I must speak with you, Monsieur Poirot. There are things I should have told you earlier, but I was frightened, confused. I didn't know what to do. They retired to the privacy of the study, where James Worthington collapsed into a chair with the air of a man who had reached the end of his endurance. It's about the cufflink you found at the cottage. I know it's mine. I lost it there 2 nights ago when I went to meet Uncle Reggie. The detective's interest sharpened. You met with Sir Reginald at the cottage. He'd summoned me there to discuss my financial difficulties. Aunt Margaret had told him about the debts, you see, and he wanted to discuss terms for his assistance. But when I arrived, he wasn't alone. Who was with him? Dr. Hartwell. They were having what sounded like a very serious discussion about medical matters, something about certificates and official documents. When they saw me approaching, Dr. Hartwell left immediately, and Uncle Reggie seemed quite agitated. This was an unexpected development. Dr. Hartwell's presence at the cottage suggested a level of involvement in Sir Reginald's affairs that went beyond simple medical care. Did you overhear any specifics of their conversation? James shook his head. Not really, though I did hear Uncle Reggie mention something about maintaining the fiction, and Dr. Hartwell responding that he couldn't be party to deception indefinitely. It sounded like they were arguing about some sort of arrangement that Dr. Hartwell wanted to end. The detective made careful notes. Here was another layer of complexity in the relationship surrounding Sir Reginald, a secret arrangement between the deceased and his family physician that had been causing tension between them. After Dr. Hartwell departed, what transpired between you and your uncle? He was quite angry with me, accused me of irresponsibility and bringing shame on the family name. But he also seemed frightened somehow. He kept checking his pocket watch and looking toward the main house as if he expected someone to appear at any moment. And the terms he offered for settling your debts? James Worthington's face flushed with embarrassment. He wanted me to sign a document acknowledging my debts and promising to reform my behavior. But there was another paper, something he wanted me to witness and sign. When I refused to sign without reading it thoroughly, he became furious and dismissed me. Do you know what this second document contained? I only glimpsed it briefly, but it appeared to be some sort of confession, a statement about wartime activities and business irregularities. Uncle Reggie seemed desperate to have it properly witnessed and signed. The detective's mind raced with the implications. Here was evidence that Sir Reginald had been preparing some sort of confession about his wartime profiteering, possibly in response to the military investigation. But why would he need young James's signature as a witness? As the interview concluded, the detective found himself with more questions than answers. Dr. Hartwell's secret involvement with Sir Reginald, the mysterious confession document, the elaborate staging of the suicide scene, all suggested a conspiracy far more complex than a simple murder motivated by wartime guilt or financial desperation. That evening, as the household prepared for what would be their final night at Thornfield Manor, the detective requested a private interview with Dr. Hartwell. The physician agreed with visible reluctance, though his professional composure remained intact. "Doctor, I believe you have not been entirely forthcoming about your relationship with Sir Reginald. Young Worthington has informed us of your meeting at the cottage 2 nights ago." Dr. Hartwell's face went pale, but he maintained his dignity. "James saw us there. Indeed, he also overheard portions of your conversation, references to maintaining fictions and your reluctance to continue some form of deception. Perhaps you would care to explain." For a long moment, Dr. Hartwell sat in silence, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Reggie Ashworth was not a well man, Monsieur Poirot. He had been suffering from a progressive neurological condition for the past 2 years, a condition that would eventually have rendered him incapable of managing his affairs or even caring for himself. And you have been concealing this diagnosis." At his insistence, yes. Reggie was terrified that knowledge of his condition would destroy his business empire and leave his family destitute. He convinced me to falsify medical reports and provide false certificates of good health when required. The detective made careful notes. "But recently you had begun to question this arrangement. The military investigation changed everything." Reggie knew that if investigators discovered his medical condition, they might question his competency during the war years. Paradoxically, his illness could have provided him with a defense against charges of deliberate profiteering. Dr. Hartwell paused, struggling with the moral implications of his confession. "I told him that I could no longer be party to the deception. His condition was worsening rapidly, and he needed proper medical care, not elaborate charades to maintain his public image." And his response? He became increasingly desperate, erratic in his behavior. He spoke of ending it all rather than facing the humiliation of public exposure. I tried to convince him that there were other options, but he seemed determined to resolve matters in his own way. The doctor's testimony added yet another dimension to the complex web of motives and relationships surrounding Sir Reginald's death. A man facing both criminal investigation and progressive illness, desperate to maintain his dignity and protect his family's future. Such a person might indeed choose suicide over slow degradation. Yet the detective remained convinced that murder, not suicide, was the answer to the mystery of Thornfield Manor. The physical evidence was simply too elaborate, too carefully arranged to be the work of a man in the final moments of life. "Time," he murmured to himself as Dr. Hartwell departed. "Always it comes back to time, and the theft of those crucial minutes that allowed a killer to transform murder into apparent suicide. Chapter 8: The Hour of Truth. The final morning at Thornfield Manor dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the lawns and the October sun casting long shadows through the tall windows. The detective had spent a sleepless night assembling the final pieces of his deduction, and now he prepared to reveal the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. Inspector Meadows remained skeptical of any conclusion other than suicide, but he had agreed to gather all the surviving members of the dinner party in the drawing room for what the detective termed a final review of the evidence. As the group assembled, Lady Worthington maintaining her rigid dignity, young James fidgeting with his remaining cufflink, Colonel Mercer standing at military attention, Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell seated together with professional composure, the detective noted how each person's demeanor reflected their relationship to the deceased and their knowledge of the evening's events. Mesdames et messieurs, the detective began, positioning himself before the ornate fireplace like a lecturer addressing his students, we have gathered here to solve a puzzle that has confounded us for 3 days. The apparent suicide of Sir Reginald Ashworth presents us with numerous inconsistencies and contradictions that demand explanation. He paused, allowing his gaze to move from face to face, reading the subtle signs of guilt, fear, and anticipation that each person displayed. Let us begin with the fundamental question of time. Sir Reginald excused himself from dinner at approximately 8:45. Dr. Hartwell initially stated that the gunshot was heard at 9:15, but later revised his estimate to 9:17. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall, which had been keeping perfect time when we arrived, was found to be running 3 minutes slow the morning after the tragedy. Inspector Meadows nodded. We've established that the clock mechanism was tampered with, though the significance remains unclear. Ah, but the significance is crucial, mon ami. You see, someone needed additional time to kill Sir Reginald, stage his death as suicide, and establish an alibi by being present in the dining room when the sound of a gunshot was heard. The detective moved to a small side table where he had arranged various pieces of evidence collected during the investigation. Consider, if you will, this sequence of events. Sir Reginald is killed in his study at approximately 9 o'clock. The killer then has 15 to 20 minutes to arrange the scene, positioning the body, placing the revolver, applying artificial powder residue to simulate suicide. But the killer needs to establish an alibi, so they return to the dining room and at the appropriate moment create the sound of a gunshot. But we all heard the gunshot, protested Mrs. Hartwell. Surely you're not suggesting it was some sort of theatrical effect? Not at all, madame. The gunshot was quite real, but it was not the shot that killed Sir Reginald. It was a second shot, fired into the air or into the ground outside the French windows, designed to establish the precise moment of apparent suicide. The detective picked up the linen napkin that had been found in the study. This napkin bearing the Ashworth family crest provides us with a crucial clue. It came from the dining room, carried by someone who needed to muffle the sound of that second gunshot. Observe how it is folded, not crumpled. It was used as a silencer, wrapped around the revolver to deaden the sound sufficiently that those in the dining room would hear only a sharp crack rather than the full report of the weapon. Colonel Mercer stepped forward. Are you accusing one of us of this elaborate deception? I am stating facts, Colonel, and allowing those facts to lead us to the truth. The killer needed several things to succeed: medical knowledge to stage the suicide convincingly, access to Sir Reginald's study, familiarity with the house layout, and the ability to move freely without arousing suspicion. He turned to Dr. Hartwell, whose face had grown increasingly pale during the explanation. Doctor, your medical expertise would certainly qualify you to arrange a convincing suicide scene. You knew about Sir Reginald's neurological condition, his fears about the military investigation, his desperation to protect his family's honor. You also had access to his study as his personal physician. Dr. Hartwell's hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair. You cannot seriously suspect me of murdering my patient. Suspect? No, doctor, I do not suspect. I know. You killed Sir Reginald Ashworth, and you did so for the most noble of reasons: to spare him the humiliation of public disgrace and to provide his family with the insurance settlement that his suicide would ensure. The room erupted in shocked exclamations, but the detective continued relentlessly.
Sir Reginald's neurological condition was progressing rapidly, as you told us. He faced exposure as a war profiteer, financial ruin, and the slow degradation of his mental faculties. In his desperation he had begun to speak of suicide, but you knew he lacked the courage to carry it through himself. "This is monstrous," Mrs. Hartwell cried. "My husband would never—" "Your husband, madame, saw an opportunity to spare his patient unnecessary suffering while simultaneously protecting the family he served. The insurance policy on Sir Reginald's life would provide financial security for his dependents, but only if his death appeared to be suicide rather than murder." The detective moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds where Sir Reginald had walked for the last time just 3 days earlier. The plan was elaborate but not complex. Dr. Hartwell arranged to meet Sir Reginald in his study under the pretext of discussing his medical condition. Perhaps he brought sedatives, claiming they would help with Sir Reginald's anxiety. Once the patient was unconscious, the doctor administered the fatal shot. "But the timing," Inspector Meadows interjected. "Ah yes, the timing. This is where Dr. Hartwell's plan becomes truly ingenious. After killing Sir Reginald and beginning to stage the suicide scene, he realized he needed more time to complete his work properly. So he used his medical knowledge of the grandfather clock's mechanism. Many physicians become quite skilled with precision instruments to stop the clock temporarily." The detective turned back to face the assembled group. "With the clock stopped, Dr. Hartwell had the time he needed to perfect his staging. He arranged Sir Reginald's body, placed the revolver in position, applied artificial powder residue, and scattered papers to suggest the deceased had been contemplating his situation. Then he returned to the dining room, restarted the clock, and waited for the appropriate moment." "What moment?" Lady Worthington asked, her voice barely audible. "The moment to fire the second shot, the one we all heard, Doctor." Hartwell excused himself from the table briefly, went to the study, wrapped the revolver in the dinner napkin to muffle its report, and fired a shot through the open French windows. Then he quickly returned to the dining room, discarded the napkin in the study where it would be found later, and joined the group rushing to investigate the sound. Dr. Hartwell had begun to weep silently, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of accusation and guilt. "The stopped pocket watch found at the cottage was your masterstroke, Doctor. You planted it there to implicate Colonel Mercer, knowing that his wartime grievances against Sir Reginald would make him a natural suspect. You also planted the military decoration and the letters, creating a trail of evidence that would lead investigators away from the truth." "But why?" Mrs. Hartwell whispered. "Why would Edmund do such a thing?" The detective's voice softened with compassion. "Because, madame, your husband is a good man who saw his patient suffering and chose to end that suffering in the most merciful way possible. Sir Reginald Ashworth was dying by degrees, his mind failing, his reputation in ruins, his family facing poverty. Dr. Hartwell gave him a dignified exit and ensured that his dependents would be provided for." Inspector Meadows had been taking notes throughout the explanation, though his expression suggested he was still struggling to accept the detective's conclusions. "The evidence supports this theory. Every piece of physical evidence confirms it, Inspector. The manipulated timing, the staged scene, the planted evidence all point to someone with medical knowledge and intimate access to the household. Dr. Hartwell had means, motive, and opportunity. More importantly, he had the compassion to see murder as an act of mercy." Dr. Hartwell finally looked up, his eyes red with tears but his voice steady. "Reggie was my friend as well as my patient. He was terrified of what lay ahead, the investigation, the trial, the slow destruction of his mind by disease. He begged me to help him end it, but he couldn't bring himself to do it alone. He wanted to protect his family, ensure they would be provided for after his death. The insurance policy would accomplish that, but only if his death appeared to be suicide." The doctor's confession filled the drawing room like a physical presence heavy with the weight of revealed truth and moral complexity.
"I told myself I was performing a final act of medical care," Dr. Hartwell continued, his voice growing stronger as he unburdened himself of the secret that had tormented him. "Reggie was in pain, not just physical pain from his condition, but the deeper agony of a proud man facing inevitable humiliation. When he asked for my help, how could I refuse?" Mrs. Hartwell reached for her husband's hand, her face a portrait of conflicted love and horror. "Edmund, how could you not tell me? How could you carry this burden alone?" "Because I knew you would try to stop me, Sarah. and because I still believe, that what I did was right. Reggie died peacefully, without fear or suffering. His family will be provided for, his reputation preserved. Is that not a better outcome than months of legal proceedings, public disgrace, and slow mental deterioration? Inspector Meadows cleared his throat uncomfortably. Dr. Hartwell, I must caution you that anything you say may be used as evidence in legal proceedings. You are under no obligation to continue this confession. But the doctor seemed determined to complete his testimony. The plan was more complex than Monsieur Poirot described, though he has captured its essential elements correctly. I spent weeks preparing, studying the household routines, the layout of the house, the habits of the family and servants. He paused, collecting his thoughts with the precision of a medical professional organizing a case presentation. The stopped clock was indeed crucial to the timing. I had observed its mechanism during previous visits to the house, and knew exactly how to halt and restart it. The artificial powder residue was prepared in advance, using materials from my medical bag, graphite powder mixed with lamp black to simulate gunpowder burns. The detective nodded with professional appreciation, and the planted evidence at the cottage. Colonel Mercer made such an obvious suspect with his wartime grievances and his surveillance activities. I knew the investigation would focus on him, if I provided the appropriate clues. The pocket watch was Sir Reginald's. He had indeed intended it as a gift to the Colonel years ago, but Mercer refused it. Reggie kept it in his desk drawer as a reminder of their complicated relationship. And young Worthington's cufflink, Dr. Hartwell actually managed a wan smile. Pure chance that, when I visited the cottage to plant the other evidence, I found it on the floor from James's earlier meeting with his uncle. It seemed providential, another potential suspect to confuse the investigation. Lady Worthington spoke for the first time since the confession began, her voice carrying the weight of aristocratic judgment. Dr. Hartwell, you may have meant well, but you have committed murder. There can be no excuse for taking another man's life, regardless of your motives. With respect, your ladyship, I helped a suffering man find peace. In my profession we call it palliative care, relieving pain when cure is impossible. This was simply the ultimate form of such care. The moral complexities of Dr. Hartwell's actions seemed to divide the room. Colonel Mercer, perhaps understanding better than most the weight of wartime decisions, appeared almost sympathetic. Young James Worthington looked confused and frightened, while Mrs. Hartwell continued to weep silently. Inspector Meadows rose with visible reluctance. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashworth. You will be transported to Winchester for formal charging and arraignment. As the inspector began the formal procedures of arrest, the detective approached Mrs. Hartwell with characteristic compassion. Madame, your husband is not an evil man. He acted from compassion, misguided perhaps, but genuine nonetheless. The courts will take such considerations into account when determining his fate. Mrs. Hartwell looked up through her tears. Will they understand, do you think? Will anyone understand that he was trying to help? I believe, madame, that those who knew both your husband and Sir Reginald will understand exactly what motivated this tragedy. Dr. Hartwell committed murder, but he did so to prevent greater suffering. That is not an excuse, but it may prove to be a mitigation. As Dr. Hartwell was led away, his dignity intact despite the handcuffs, the remaining members of the dinner party began to disperse. The grand house seemed to settle around them like a living thing exhaling after holding its breath for 3 days. Colonel Mercer approached the detective as they prepared to depart. You knew, didn't you? From the very beginning, you suspected it wasn't suicide. The evidence spoke to anyone willing to listen, Colonel. But I confess, I did not immediately suspect Dr. Hartwell. His motive was so different from the usual reasons for murder: greed, revenge, passion. He killed from compassion, which is perhaps the most tragic motive of all. And Sir Reginald, will the truth about his wartime activities come to light now? The detective considered this carefully. Perhaps not, mon ami, doctor. Hartwell's actions may have accomplished what he intended, the preservation of Sir Reginald's public reputation and the financial security of his family. The insurance company will likely pay the claim, the military investigation may be quietly dropped, and the world will remember Sir Reginald Ashworth as a successful businessman who died tragically young. As their motor car wound through the Hampshire countryside toward London, the detective found himself reflecting on the moral complexities of the case. Murder was murder, regardless of motive, yet he could not entirely condemn Dr. Hartwell's actions. In a world still scarred by the brutalities of war, where so many had died young and violently, perhaps there was a twisted mercy in allowing a man to choose his own exit rather than face inevitable degradation. "Time," he murmured to his companion as the spires of London appeared on the horizon. In the end, it all came down to time, stolen moments that allowed a killer to transform murder into mercy, at least in his own mind. The grandfather clock at Thornfield Manor would continue its steady ticking, marking the hours and days for whatever family might next call the manor home. But for those who had witnessed its temporary silence, time itself would forever carry the weight of secrets revealed, and the price of compassion carried too far. Chapter 9. The Scales of Justice. 3 months after the tragedy at Thornfield Manor, the case of Regina Worth, Dr. Edmund Hartwell came before the Winchester Crown Court. The detective had been summoned as a prosecution witness, though he found himself in the uncomfortable position of providing testimony that would likely send a fundamentally decent man to the gallows. The courthouse was packed with spectators, drawn by the unusual nature of the case and the moral questions it raised. Hartwell had retained one of London's finest barristers, Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, QC, who intended to mount a defense based on diminished responsibility and the mercy-killing doctrine that was slowly gaining recognition in legal circles. The prosecution, led by Mr. Justice Crawford, presented the case as a straightforward murder motivated by misguided paternalism. They argued that regardless of Dr. Hartwell's intentions, he had taken another man's life without consent and then engaged in elaborate deception to conceal his crime. The detective's testimony proved to be the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. With characteristic precision, he walked the jury through his deductive process, explaining how the physical evidence had led him to conclude that Sir Reginald's death was murder disguised as suicide. The manipulation of time was the crucial element, he explained to the 12 men who would decide Dr. Hartwell's fate. By stopping the grandfather clock and creating the illusion of a different timeline, the accused gave himself the opportunity to stage an elaborate deception. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore's cross-examination focused on the detective's interpretation of motive. "You have testified that my client acted from compassion rather than malice. Is that correct?" "That is my assessment, yes." "And in your extensive experience with criminal cases, how would you characterize a murder committed from compassion versus one committed from greed or revenge?" The detective paused, aware that his answer could significantly impact the jury's perception of Dr. Hartwell's character. A murder committed from compassion is no less a murder in legal terms, but it speaks to a different type of criminal mind. Dr. Hartwell is not a man who killed for personal gain or to satisfy violent impulses. He is a man who believed he was preventing greater suffering. The defense's most powerful witness proved to be Mrs. Sarah Hartwell herself. Her testimony about her husband's character and his genuine anguish over Sir Reginald's condition moved several jurors to tears. "My husband is a healer," she testified, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "For 25 years, I have watched him comfort the dying, ease the suffering of the sick, and struggle with the limitations of medical science. He has always believed that a physician's first duty is to do no harm, and in his mind, allowing Sir Reginald to face public disgrace and mental deterioration would have been a greater harm than ending his life peacefully." The defense also called several medical experts who testified about Sir Reginald's neurological condition and its inevitable progression. Their descriptions of the mental and physical deterioration that awaited Sir Reginald painted a grim picture of his future prospects. "Doctor, Marcus Pemberton, a specialist in neurological disorders, explained the nature of Sir Reginald's illness to the jury in terms they could understand. The patient was facing a future of progressive mental decline, loss of motor function, and eventual complete dependence on others for basic care. The condition is irreversible and invariably fatal, though death may be preceded by years of diminished capacity and suffering. In your professional opinion, Sir Geoffrey asked, would a patient facing such a diagnosis be competent to make decisions about his own care? In the early stages, yes, but as the disease progressed, his judgment would become increasingly impaired. If Sir Reginald had expressed a desire to end his life while still mentally competent, that wish might reasonably be considered his true preference, even if he later lacked the capacity to act on it. The prosecution countered with testimony from medical ethicists, who argued that a physician's duty was to preserve life, not to make judgments about its quality or value. They emphasized that Dr. Hartwell had acted unilaterally, without formal consultation or the patient's explicit consent. Colonel Mercer was called as a character witness for Sir Reginald, and his testimony provided insight into the deceased's state of mind during his final weeks. Reggie was a proud man who had built his entire identity around success and respectability, the colonel testified. The prospect of public humiliation and criminal prosecution was devastating to him. He spoke repeatedly of his fears about becoming a burden to his family and losing their respect. Did he ever express a desire to end his life? The prosecution asked. Not in so many words, but he spoke of feeling trapped by circumstances and wishing he could find an honorable way out of his difficulties. I believe he was contemplating suicide, but lacked the courage to carry it through. Young James Worthington's testimony proved somewhat damaging to the defense. His account of seeing Dr. Hartwell at the cottage suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of mercy. Dr. Hartwell seemed to be conducting some sort of surveillance of my uncle's activities, James testified. His presence at the cottage, the hidden bag of supplies we later found, it all suggests he had been planning something for quite some time. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Dr. Hartwell himself took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was delivered with the calm professionalism of a medical presentation, but the emotion underlying his words was unmistakable. I have spent my entire adult life trying to heal the sick and comfort the dying, he told the jury. When Reggie Ashworth came to me in desperation, facing not only criminal investigation, but the progressive loss of his mental faculties, I saw a man who needed my help in the most fundamental way possible. Sir Geoffrey guided his client through the events leading up to Sir Reginald's death, allowing Dr. Hartwell to explain his decision-making process. Reggie knew what lay ahead: the investigation, the trial, the public humiliation, and ultimately the complete loss of his mental capacity. He begged me to help him avoid that fate, to find a way to die with dignity, while still protecting his family's future. The insurance policy would provide for his dependents, but only if his death appeared to be suicide. Did you consider other alternatives? Of course. I suggested that he consult with specialists, explore experimental treatments, even consider fleeing the country to avoid prosecution. But he was adamant that he wanted to end his life on his own terms, and he needed my medical expertise to ensure it would appear convincing as suicide. The prosecution's cross-examination focused on Dr. Hartwell's decision to act without seeking legal or ethical counsel. Did you consult with any medical colleagues about this decision? No. Did you seek guidance from the British Medical Association's Ethics Committee? No. Did you advise Sir Reginald to consult with a barrister about his legal options? He had already done so. His solicitor had made it clear that his prospects for avoiding conviction were minimal, given the evidence the War Office had compiled. But you made the decision to kill him based solely on your own judgment of what would be best for him. Dr. Hartwell paused before answering, the weight of that decision visible in his expression. Yes, I made that decision alone, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces revealed nothing of their decision. The foreman, a middle-aged shopkeeper from Winchester, stood to deliver their judgment. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty.
However, we wish to recommend mercy due to the exceptional circumstances of this case and the defendant's evident good character. Dr. Hartwell received the verdict with the same composure he had maintained throughout the trial. The judge, Mr. Justice Pemberton, clearly struggled with the sentencing, acknowledging both the gravity of the crime and the unusual nature of the defendant's motives. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, you have been convicted of murder, one of the most serious crimes in our legal system. While the jury has found mitigating circumstances in your case, the law requires that I impose sentence accordingly to the gravity of your offense. The judge paused, consulting his notes before continuing. However, in recognition of your exemplary character, your genuine remorse, and the extraordinary circumstances that led to your actions, I sentence you to 15 years imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after serving 7 years. It was a remarkably lenient sentence for murder, reflecting the court's recognition of the moral complexity surrounding Dr. Hartwell's actions. As he was led away to begin his prison term, his wife and the detective exchanged a meaningful glance. Justice, the detective murmured to his companion as they left the courthouse, is sometimes more complicated than the law would suggest. Dr. Hartwell committed murder, but he did so from compassion rather than malice. The courts have acknowledged that distinction, even if they cannot excuse it entirely. The case would be remembered in legal circles as an early test of the mercy-killing doctrine, establishing precedents that would influence similar cases for years to come. But for those who had lived through the events at Thornfield Manor, it remained a reminder of the thin line between healing and harm, between compassion and crime. Chapter 10. The Final Chime. 5 years after the trial, the detective received an unexpected letter from Mrs. Sarah Hartwell. Her husband had been released from prison after serving just over 6 years of his sentence, his exemplary behavior, and the continued advocacy of medical professionals having convinced the parole board of his rehabilitation. Dr. Hartwell had chosen not to attempt to regain his medical license, instead finding work as a medical researcher for a London pharmaceutical company. The letter included an invitation to join the Hartwells for dinner, an opportunity to see how the years of imprisonment had affected the man who had committed murder from compassion. The detective accepted the invitation with curiosity, wondering how time and consequence had shaped Dr. Hartwell's perspective on his actions. The couple had taken a modest flat in Bloomsbury, a far cry from their previous comfortable circumstances, but clearly sufficient for their needs. Dr. Hartwell appeared older than his years, his hair now completely grey, and his face bearing the lines of a man who had faced the consequences of his choices. Yet his eyes retained the intelligence and compassion that had motivated his original act of mercy. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming," he said, his handshake firm despite the tremor that prison had added to his hands. "I wanted to thank you personally for your testimony at the trial. You could have painted me as a cold-blooded killer, but instead you helped the jury understand my true motivations." Mrs. Hartwell had prepared a simple meal, and over dinner, Dr. Hartwell spoke candidly about his years in prison and his current perspective on the events at Thornfield Manor. "I have had considerable time to reflect on my actions," he said, "and I remain convinced that I did the right thing, even though I understand why society must punish such actions. Reggie Ashworth died peacefully, his family was provided for, and his reputation remained intact. The alternative would have been months or years of suffering for everyone involved." "You have no regrets then?" the detective asked. Dr. Hartwell considered the question carefully. "I regret the deception, the lies I told to cover my tracks. I regret the pain I caused my wife, and the damage to my professional reputation, but I do not regret ending Reggie's suffering when he lacked the courage to do so himself." Mrs. Hartwell had remained largely silent during dinner, but now she spoke with quiet dignity. "Edmund lost everything, his career, his freedom, his position in society. But he gained something as well, the certainty that he acted according to his conscience rather than conventional morality. I cannot say I would make the same choice, but I understand why he did." The conversation turned to more recent developments. The detective learned that the Ashworth estate had indeed paid out the insurance claim, providing financial security for Sir Reginald's dependents. The military investigation had been quietly dropped, officially due to lack of evidence, but more likely out of respect for a family that had already suffered enough tragedy. Young James Worthington had reformed his gambling habits, and now managed one of the smaller Ashworth business ventures. Lady Worthington had moved to Bath, where she maintained a small but elegant household befitting her reduced circumstances, but unchanged dignity. Colonel Mercer had returned to his military career, and was currently serving in India, having apparently found peace with the demons that had driven his quest for justice against Sir Reginald. The cottage at Thornfield Manor had been torn down, removing the physical reminder of the secrets it had harboured. Time, Dr. Hartwell observed, as the evening drew to a close, has a way of providing perspective on our actions. What seemed like a crisis requiring immediate action 5 years ago, now appears as simply another chapter in the longer story of human struggle and decision. The detective nodded thoughtfully. And yet, Doctor, your actions continue to influence the present. The legal precedents established by your case have affected how courts handle similar situations. Your choice to end one man's suffering has potentially eased the path for others facing similar dilemmas. I hope that is true. If my prosecution and imprisonment have helped establish clearer guidelines for physicians facing such impossible choices, then perhaps some good has come from this tragedy. As the detective prepared to leave, Dr. Hartwell made one final observation that would stay with him for years to come. You know, Monsieur Poirot, people often speak of the grandfather clock at Thornfield Manor as if it were somehow complicit in the deception. But clocks don't lie, they simply measure time as accurately as their mechanisms allow. It was humans who chose to manipulate time for their own purposes, just as humans choose to end life or preserve it according to their own moral calculations. The detective walked through the London streets that night, reflecting on the complex legacy of the Thornfield Manor case. Dr. Hartwell had indeed committed murder, but his crime had been motivated by compassion rather than malice. The courts had recognized this distinction, while still upholding the principle that taking another person's life could not be excused, regardless of motive. In the years that followed, the case would be cited in legal proceedings involving euthanasia and mercy killing. Medical schools would use Dr. Hartwell's story as a case study in professional ethics, examining the conflict between a physician's duty to preserve life and the desire to end suffering. The grandfather clock at Thornfield Manor had been purchased by a museum, where it continued to keep perfect time for visitors who knew nothing of its role in one of the most morally complex murder cases of the decade. Its steady ticking served as a reminder that time itself remains neutral, measuring human actions without judgment or moral consideration. For the detective, the case represented something unique in his long career, a murder that he had solved with his usual logical precision, yet one that left him questioning the nature of justice and mercy. Dr. Edmund Hartwell had committed the ultimate crime, but he had done so from the highest motives. The law had punished him appropriately, yet the detective could not entirely condemn his actions. In his private notes on the case, written years later, the detective would observe, "The tragedy at Thornfield Manor teaches us that even the most logical mind must sometimes acknowledge the limitations of pure reason when confronted with the complexities of human compassion." Dr. Hartwell stole time itself in service of what he believed to be mercy, and while the law correctly punished him for this theft, history may judge him more kindly than his contemporaries did. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, as the detective reached his own flat, its bronze voice echoing through the London night. Time marched on with mechanical precision, indifferent to human struggles and moral dilemmas. Yet for those who had lived through the events at Thornfield Manor, time would forever carry the weight of choices made and consequences faced, of compassion that crossed the line into crime, and of the thin boundary between healing and harm. The second chime at 9:15 had indeed revealed the truth, though that truth proved more complex and morally ambiguous than anyone had anticipated. In the end, justice had been served, but mercy had been served as well, creating a legacy that would influence legal and medical ethics for generations to come. Thus concludes our tale from the archives of Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and I thank you for joining me in this exploration of one of Hercule Poirot's most morally complex cases. The detectives' little grey cells had indeed solved the mystery of Sir Reginald Ashworth's death, but they had also revealed the deeper mystery of human nature itself, our capacity for both great compassion and terrible judgment, sometimes embodied in the same act. Until our next mystery, remember that time tells all truths, even those we might prefer to keep hidden. Good night.